Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's Public Service Board Select Committee. Sorry that we're a slightly late start in this afternoon's meeting. First item on the agenda is to elect a chair, so please can I have nominations? Councillor Trahan?
Nominate Councillor Petrini, please.
Do we have a seconder? Councillor Roden. Councillor Petrini, if you'd like to make your way to the front. And then we'll begin with some introductions.
I'd like to thank my colleagues. First, let's start off with introductions from my right and then around.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny.
Nicola Perry, Democratic Services.
Good afternoon, Richard Jones, Performance Manager at Monmouthshire County Council.
Charlotte Drury, I'm Service Manager in Children's Services in Monmouthshire.
Oh, sorry. I'm Bronwyn John. I'm the Head of Service for the Health Board for Monmouthshire.
Good afternoon, I'm Sharon Lloyd, I'm the Communities and Partnerships Manager for Monmouthshire Council.
Good afternoon. I'm Councillor Jamie Trahan for Overmont Ward, member of this committee.
Hello, Richard Roden, member of this committee.
David Dovey. Sorry. St King's Mount Ward, Chepstow.
Thank you. So we move on straight onto the agenda. Apologies for absence.
Yes, Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor Dimmock, Pavia, Councillor Taylor, Feekins and Councillor Thomas.
Thank you. Item 3, declarations of interest. As and when, if you have any interest, write on the pro forma. Item 4, public open forum. Any public? I'm informed there is no public. Just double checking. No. Item 5, minutes of the previous meeting held on the 26th of March. Anyone want to make any comments? Move to accept. Second. There's no one here to second. Should we move on to the next agenda? Yes. Okay. We'll move that on to the next agenda to be cleared. Item 6, progressing the steps in the wellbeing plan. And I'm Bevan, I believe.
Okay, we're going to pass over to Sharon.
Good afternoon all. You would have received a covering report to this agenda item, and what we're bringing before the committee today is to provide the context and a presentation today on the progress that's been made in relation to the last priority step that the PSB has prioritised since October last year. That step is being led by our partners in the Aneurin Bevan University Health Board, and they're contributing towards the step of emotional resilience and well-being of children and young people at the moment. So the report before you is really just to bring forward this step today, and the officers here today are very kindly going to present the progress that we've made in relation to this step. This will be the final step of the 6. You've received the 5 presentations prior to this from the other step leads. So this will be the final one today, and then progress will go back to the Public Services Board then, and comments likewise around the progress that's been made. And then we will look then to bring forward what the PSB's next intention is around driving this work forward. So I won't go on any longer. I'll pass over to my colleagues and get the presentation on the screen for you. Thank you.
Hello. Can I firstly apologise for the fact that the first part of this presentation is not actually mine. Because of the fact that it's the holiday period, several people haven't been able to join us today. But I am the programme board lead for the STEP. So what I'm presenting in the first part of this is on behalf of Dr. Luke Jones, who is the clinical psychologist who's leading the work for the whole of the Gwent region on transforming children and adolescent mental health services. That's right. It's a bit of a mouthful. CAMS services for short. Okay. What the data shows us is that. Oh, you're not there.
Sorry, hang on 1 second. There we go.
It's okay. I've got it on. Yeah. What the data shows us is that 70% of children and young people who experience mental health problems haven't had appropriate interventions early enough. That child and adolescent formal mental health services are under pressure. In Wales, they've had an over 100% increase in referrals in the last 4 years. And approximately 50% of adults who end up with enduring mental health problems will have had symptoms by the time they're 14. So it's really important that we concentrate on picking children up early and supporting them to enable them to manage their problems from a very early age. There's a very close link between this step on the PSB agenda and the ACES step, which has already been presented to you. So there is a huge link between mental health issues and adverse childhood experiences. And many mental health problems do start early in life as a result of a range of things, deprivation, poverty, poor attachment, trauma, loss or abuse. So it is a huge area of work, which is one of the reasons I think why this is one of the last steps to come to this scrutiny committee, because it has been a big learning curve for us and a lot of work going on to actually try to get together a response that we can actually fill the gaps. I'm going to skip through the next few slides because this was done for a workshop of the Public Services Board that we had a few weeks ago, where the programme board had to present this step to our officer members, senior members, and there's an awful lot of detail. I'm just conscious if we go through...
Sorry to interrupt. Councillor Roden, you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Would it be possible to furnish us with the slides at some point, because it's a bit difficult to read at this moment and I can't take notes very well?
Yes, absolutely. We've got the slides and we can send you a full set of the slides afterwards. That's not a problem at all.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. Sorry, Chair.
I'm not skipping through this bit because it's unimportant. It's just that it's the time to actually present it all. Suffice to say that there is a lot of evidence that shows that early intervention is the right way forward for children's services. This was picked up through the engagement exercise, which identified this as one of the priority steps for Monmouthshire anyway. So it's just background evidence, really. What is happening on a regional level is that there's a programme to transform service provision for children's mental health and well-being. It was part of the bid that was made by Gwent to a fund which was set up by Welsh Government, which is about transforming health services more broadly. And we were the only region in Wales that identified this as one of our priority steps. The provision of statutory health services for children with mental health difficulties has relied on a pyramid model where the level of access has been at a level of serious mental health difficulties. So the professionals have been cited in tier 4 at the top of the pyramid of services. What that's done is it hasn't stemmed the tide of children and young people coming up through the system with problems. It's just been able to target those people with the most severe need. And the next slide shows you an iceberg. Basically what that demonstrates is the bit above the water is the bit that's historically been tackled by statutory services, and the huge, much bigger bit below the water has had very little support and concentration. The next one shows you that iceberg translated into the clinicians in the service. So the qualified mental health professionals are all at the top, and there's been very, very little professional intervention lower down in the system. That's resulted, I think it would be fair to say, and some of you have probably been on the receiving end of complaints from some of your people living in your communities about inability to access services and frustration that they were unable to get support for their own children when they're experiencing what they perceive to be very serious problems, but the gateway to access into the services has been too tight and they've not been able to get in. The next one is that's what it's actually like for a family trying to negotiate the system. It's a complete knot of complicated processes, which does lead from a professional perspective to turf wars as well, between professionals, which is not helpful. And it's actually missing the point that brain development and environment are inextricably linked, and we need to get there while we can at the very beginning of the brain development. So there's huge evidence, for example, to show that, and you're probably aware that providing the right environment for children in their very early years is absolutely critical. The next slide is about the ACEs, which we won't go over again because I think you're all already aware from the ACEs presentation of what the factors are that make it more likely that children will suffer from mental health and emotional problems later in their lives related to their experiences. And it's quite clear that we need a new model in order to actually meet people's needs lower down the system. So a big piece of work has been started on a Gwent-wide basis. Monmouthshire is very much signed up to this, to link the specialist service to what is already out there in community services, working much lower down the system and being there to support local teams to actually target children at the early stages. And Charlotte's going to talk in a minute about how we're actually doing that in Monmouthshire. It's about building a culture of support for professionals, not to refer children on, but to actually manage things at as low a level as possible, which is what children and their families want. They don't want to go off to some specialist. They want somebody who's there when they need them. And it's about the family. It's not just about the child or young person in isolation. It is about the family. And it's about teams working together, moving away from the culture of silo working towards this is where you go, you can get everything you need here, one front door approach. The way that services will work together will be based on some underpinning principles around meeting the needs of the child, the emotional well-being of the child being paramount in everything we're doing, and getting rid of those professional silos. There are some additional staff who are going to be part of this service. One of the key things is to lower the access bar to psychology by having community psychology services available. And we actually have got the first part of that in Monmouthshire in place already. Peer support, close attention being paid to parent and infant perinatal mental health. We've actually got a service now running in all the parts of Monmouthshire where there are perinatal mental health specialists working with antenatal and postnatal mums and babies to try to support them in the early years if they've got attachment issues or postnatal depression, those sorts of things. So that service is in its early days, but it is there. School health nursing, there's a lot of work being done to move the focus of school health nursing around from the more traditional model of looking after children's physical needs, because actually there is a huge body of evidence that emotional and mental health needs are on the rise and are expressed very freely and often by children in school. And we actually attended a meeting of the Youth Forum last week where they had raised emotional well-being and mental health as one of their key priorities, and there was a lot of discussion in that forum about how we can improve support within schools. School health nurses were seen as a key part of the team, along with access to community psychology support and other team members within the education system and the youth service being embedded within schools to provide that there. A multi-agency resource hub is something we're going to cover later. And as I've mentioned, the whole school approach is absolutely critical to this for the older children. Community psychology, we've covered that off. We do have that already in place. It's recent, it's new. In fact, at the Youth Forum, our new community psychologist was there and introduced herself during the lunchtime to the representatives from the different schools, and is going to work with each of the high schools in Monmouthshire to try to improve knowledge and awareness of what she's able to do to support people. And she'll be working also at a community level, won't she, to understand what it is that's needed to make the systems work better. So she'll be a key part of our future design of services as well. Community family intervention. There is a range of services already available there. I don't know whether Charlotte probably knows a lot more about this than I do, to be honest.
Would it be helpful if
It would, yeah. This part of it is probably where
Right.
it moves more to your area of expertise.
Okay, so I'm going to just pick up very briefly on the community psychology bit, because there's as Bron was saying, that is new, but we have an excellent community psychologist. We were very lucky, I think, in the appointment that we had. It was somebody who already knows the Monmouthshire context, because we were lucky enough to be working with her in another bit of the service that I'll talk a bit about in a bit. And she has some really good ideas, a really good understanding of Monmouthshire, a really good understanding about what our specific pressures. One of the issues that we have, I think, with regional bids is that Monmouthshire is really very different to the other parts of Gwent. So having something that is regionally coherent but bespoke to Monmouthshire is really critical for us, because, for example, one of the things we know is that children in our more deprived communities suffer greater because of their perceived deprivation. They understand how deprived they are. And that is a big issue for us. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is people say, oh, Monmouthshire doesn't have any real needs because it's an affluent area. And whilst you have some deprived children, obviously, but you don't have very many, so we don't have to worry very much. But actually what we do know from a research basis, and from some research that was actually done by the person who's driven the community psychology work on a regional level, is that children who are growing up in relatively affluent areas but from deprived communities suffer exponentially because they are very conscious of that difference.
I just say as chair, hallelujah for you saying that statement.
And I think it's one of the things that from a service perspective, we're really working hard to address. Inequality impacts on us all negatively wherever you sit. And the more we can understand that and address that, the better for the whole of Monmouthshire, wherever you sit on that social divide. So I got a bit distracted then. So into some of the things that are being done in community psychology, there's an area of work called Circle of Security. And this is an attachment-based, group-based, highly evidence-based intervention of working with families to meet the attachment needs at an early stage with their children. It's highly evidence-based, and we've been lucky enough to get, it's being done regionally. Training places cost in the region of about £800 per person. We've been able to train 10 people from Monmouthshire in May, and we have another 10 or 12 places coming up in September. And what that is enable us to do, very often what happens in training is you train a couple of people, we say, oh, hallelujah, that was fantastic, and then it doesn't get embedded. so, because we don't have capacity. So this is about training enough people to get that sustainability within the model. So we have a communication and training strategy and group work strategy in relation to that piece of work that will enable that to become an embedded model within Monmouthshire, and that's being led by the community. It's one of the things that she's leading on. She's doing other really helpful things as well, but I was just using that as an example. So although that's early, it's really underway and it's really gaining momentum already. One of the things that Bron touched on was this concept of support in. So it's this idea that we have lots of people, for example, in housing, supporting people, housing funds, lots of floating support workers. They're doing a lot of hands-on direct work with families. Children live in families. They're not little isolated beings that aren't connected to anything. Therefore, our more effective interventions are family-based interventions, not seeing children as separate from that. It's one of the reasons why one of the things that we're also trying to work on is community-focused schools and schools-focused communities. Those two ideas coming together so that communities embrace the school as part of the community and school embrace the community as part of the school. So it becomes a learning community, not something that sits in its nice little ivory tower behind the school gates, and education is something that happens between 9 o'clock and 3:30. And that's particularly important for the parents of children who may have had quite a negative experience of education themselves and are therefore less well disposed to those really important communications with teachers that can make all of the entire difference to a child. So that whole community focus across the system is really, really important. And I think it's very aligned with what's happening in health, what's happening in education, what's happening in children's services. So, and it feels to me like we're growing some momentum around this agenda that I feel genuinely really excited about at the moment. It feels like we're beginning to lift our head a little bit above the parapet of just crisis intervention and beginning to be able to think a little bit more strategically about what are those critical points of intervention that are actually going to make a difference. And sometimes it's not about the massive, great, big ticket items. Sometimes it's about that supporting idea that the support worker that, frankly, we don't pay an awful lot of money to, but who has a good relationship with the family, that is going in, day out. How do we help them do their job better? And maybe, rather than taking the child out and busing them to some clinic somewhere, which they will be resistant to, and that's what we're finding. They don't want to go there. A lot of these families that might need that support are quite chaotic and find those kinds of things a challenge to engage with anyway. So it's not a very efficient a way of spending that finite resource. Maybe a better way of spending that resource is using that clinician to support the worker who has the relationship to do their job in a more informed, more psychologically informed, a more therapeutic way that's more containing to the family and enables them to engage with the ideas that we need them to engage with. Does that make sense? And we're ahead of the game in Monmouthshire with this, because the model of intervention that we've had going for a while actually is already a support-in model. We've been doing support-in actually for about 5 or 6 years. We haven't been doing very much of it because we haven't had a lot of people to do that, but we already have that concept of support-in, and we're doing that support-in. We have systemic family therapy, not a lot of it in our system, but we have that. We have play therapy in our system, not a lot of it, not enough of it, but we have some of it. And we have psychology within our system, not a lot of it, but a bit of it. And what that enables us to do, because of how we've deployed it in Monmouthshire, which is across the pre- and post-statutory threshold, it enables us to support in across the system. So I'm going to whiz through some of the next things because I know I'm going way over the time that you want me to take. So basically to say there's an awful lot going on, there's new money coming in, and I think
Sorry, just to interrupt you, the presentation is slightly stopped.
Yeah.
The presentation has just gone off the screen. So
If you can take it to my bit at the end then. Yeah.
Great.
So if
Back.
you just whiz it to my bit. Right, Multi-Agency Resource Hub. A bit further on. Yeah, so...
Luke had a lot of
yeah.
slides. It was a lot.
So yeah, this is it's a couple of slides back. Yeah, back, there. And you can have all of these. So I'm not going to go into detail because the principles of the service are absolutely what you would expect the principles of a service like this to be. It's about being strengths-based. It's about understanding the values that drive and underpin the service. So I'm not going to deal with that in detail. This is highly aligned with the ACES step, as you would expect it to be, and you would be fairly shocked if it wasn't. So in terms of wellbeing services, there are other things actually that aren't on this, but these are some of the things that sit within the local authority. So we have a relatively new team called the Achieving Change Together team. This is a small team. It's psychologically informed, systemically informed. There is some systemic family therapy and some clinical psychology in there, and as well as other therapeutic support there. And it's a small team that works with families who have children who are on the cusp of coming into care, or who have been in care and we are rehabilitating home. And it's to put that support for a longish period of time to really understand how change needs to happen in that family, to hold that family, to sit with that family, and to really embed the learning and understanding that they need to do so that their children can remain at home safe with them. And I have to say, it's small, there's only 3 of them. They can only work because they're working intensively with 12 families at a time. But we're really seeing some positive, at this really early stage. They've only been in post since October, but there's a couple of families where we have been working generationally. This is a 3rd generation that we've been working with, and we have seen change that nobody else has been able to effect with one family in particular. Interestingly, the team is also working with her daughter and her daughter's daughter. So it's that generational. So this is really about how do we change and disrupt that generational aspect of some of the challenges that our children face. So that's quite exciting. Building Strong Families team. I've been before scrutiny before talking about this. This is our TAF model, Team Around the Family model. And we changed it from a team of people who were coordinating activity, which is a traditional TAF model. The problem with Monmouthshire is that we don't get very much Families First money, and we didn't have very many services to coordinate. So having people to coordinate not very many services didn't seem to me to be a very effective use of that resource. And it seemed to me to be a much more effective use of the resource to deploy those people to work hands-on with families. So they do short-term interventions, and again, they're showing really positive impacts. They use a distance travel tool, so they can evidence the outcomes they are bringing, and it also disperses responsibility for that coordination to all kinds of people. It's about saying, do you know what, it's not always the local authority's responsibility to do this. Sometimes there are other people within the system that we can draw on to do some of this work. And also working with families so they understand their own responsibilities and they have agency. They're not sat there helpless within the chaos of their lives. They can take ownership and take responsibility for their own change. Creative Therapies team, that's part of the system. We have systemic family therapy and play therapy in there. That's our we have school-based counselling for secondary pupils, but the talking therapy isn't necessarily an effective way of working with younger children who have those emotional well-being needs. So we meet that in a more therapeutic way. Family group. Sorry. Family group conferencing services, which is comes from an Aboriginal communities originally, and it's about a way of working with families so they create their own solutions, and that's hand in glove with social work solutions at times, but it's a really effective way of getting families to drive their own change because they identify what for them is their problem and what is going to be their solution. Because they come up with the solutions themselves, it tends to be much more sustainable. It's much easier than somebody coming in and saying, this is what you need to do. We can all be very resistant to that. And school-based counselling needs a bit of looking at. So I'm in the process, I'm doing a bit of review of the school-based counselling service because I think that needs a bit of tweaking. I think it has been fit for purpose, but I think as the environment is changing around well-being resources for children and young people, we need to make sure that everything that's happening adds value to everything else that's happening, so it doesn't sit within a little bubble. And I want to make sure that we get the maximum bang for our buck at every point that we can, because our resources are finite and we can't afford not to do that. I'm not going to talk about that because that's not very interesting. Early help panel. This is one of the big change. Well, this isn't a big change for Monmouth, actually. It's a big change for the rest of Wales because they're copying us. This is something that we do really, really well. And one of the things that I was told when I first came to Monmouthshire is that we don't have any services here in Monmouthshire. And what I discovered quite quickly was that it wasn't entirely true. It was a little bit true, but not as true as people thought. And what we had was something over here and something over here and something over here, but nothing was adding any value to itself. And there was lots of duplication. So a health visitor or a school would be very worried about a family, so they would fire off 7 different referrals to 7 different agencies in the vain hope that somebody would pick up something. So lots of duplication and lots of wastage in the system. So what we did was we noticed that and brought together what we call an early help panel. And it's called SPACE because some work I was doing with Luke Jones on the primary care mental health pilot. I came from Newport. The pilot was being done in Newport and in Monmouthshire. So that was really helpful because I could bring how it had worked in Newport, because if you can make it work in both those authorities, you can make something work because they're so the opposite ends of the spectrum. So I was able to bring the ideas that had worked and hadn't worked so well in Newport and to think about how we could apply it in a very different local authority in Monmouthshire. And what that enabled us to do was, first of all, lever in additional resources, so bring in primary care mental health into that panel and bring together a whole range of people that are the doers. They actually deliver services to families, and then route referrals from GPs, from schools, from other providers and from people themselves into a single, so not necessarily a single doorway, but lots of doorways into a single panel where people could say, actually, I've worked with that family. I have worked with that family as well. Maybe this time we need this kind of response rather than everybody picking up the same referral. So what it did immediately was reduce duplication. It improved, there was a no bounce principle. So the idea is that families feel it is seamless, even if it's not seamless behind the scenes. Their experience of it is a referral is made and they get a response. And all the mess happens over there where they're not aware of it, they don't feel it. So they are getting a better response, a better informed response, and a more appropriate response first time. And that's working really, really well. It's working so well that CAMHS decided to hijack it a bit and bring in CAMHS referrals through that panel as well. And that's at an early stage. There are some teething problems to that. We are working on that. But I think it shows how dynamic the environment is and the real willingness. And this is what I've found since I've been in Monmouthshire. There is such a willingness to work together. There is such a willingness to make things work, to really think about how can we add value to each other. So that's how that works. Health have brought a bit of resource into that. So we have what we call a space wellbeing coordinator, which sounds kind of like they should be floating around the place. And she works with our early help services manager to support that panel and make that panel work as effectively as it needs to. There's some ideas about membership. We have housing on there, we have YOS on there, we've got sport development, Acorn, Flying Start, a range of people, and we're always open to new people joining us. The caveat is they have to do something useful. So it's not a talking shop, it's a team, it's a virtual team effectively of people that can take a referral away and do something useful with it. That's a referral intervention pathway, which I won't talk through because it's not very helpful or not very interesting. That's a slide that just shows the increase in referrals. I think what that shows is the difference being able to have GPs refer in. So it is putting more pressure on the system, but it also means we're picking up referrals earlier. And that's really important in terms of when you're looking at the number of referrals that children's services are receiving, which is also increasing, because what we want these services to do is ultimately contribute to a reduced pressure into children's services. We need to be getting in at an early stage before risk escalates and before problems become entrenched and more complex. I think it also reflects a general theme across the UK of children really needing that early intervention about their emotional well-being. And as Bron was saying, there is a massive overlap between physical well-being and mental well-being. And I don't think CAMHS has traditionally always been very good at recognising that and responding to that. And I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're on the way. So current pressures is increasing referrals means there's increasing pressure on the service, which means there are waiting lists in most of the services. And we're all very busy, but everybody is working to the best that we possibly can. We're really excited about the changes that are happening. We're really excited about the collaborative working. There are going to be a number of services coming in, like the family intervention service, which will work alongside our Building Strong Families team. It will be delivered by Action for Children, which will be a really helpful third sector influence into the mix. And they will pick up a lot of, they work to a very similar model to Building Strong Families, so that will be really helpful. But they will be picking up the mental health side, and Building Strong Families will be picking up, and that will enable Building Strong Families to focus much more on the parenting side. So we're really thinking carefully about how we align the services to best effect for our children and young people. And I think I'll stop there unless you've got any questions.
Thank you very much. We can hear your... Oh, you haven't finished? Or?
No, sorry, not quite.
All right.
No,
So
sorry.
back to you.
Yeah, very quickly to just sort of put into some context what we've talked about before. So there's some key things that are happening in Monmouthshire. To translate those into an action plan for the PSB partners to work on has been quite challenging because the environment is moving very quickly, and it's quite exciting to see things are getting better. There obviously are strong links with all the other priority steps. There's also a very strong link to the development of the wellbeing approach, which is happening across the whole of Monmouthshire for people of all ages. So the access into things like the community health and wellbeing centres, which we're developing. We've just had the first opening down in Chepstow of a the cabin, we call it, but it's basically a facility where voluntary sector organisations and statutory services will be at a place at a certain time, and people can go and talk to them, and they will also provide one-to-one support and go out and meet people, families and children themselves and older people, everybody, as a result of a contact made through that centre. So that approach is being developed across the whole of Monmouthshire. We're specifically looking at developing something in Caldicot which would give us a focus around children and young people. We have a former health centre in Caldicot, which is on Kymau Road, which is in one of the more deprived areas of Caldicot. And we're trying to create the opportunity for staff not only to work together virtually, but actually to work together in an area where they share the same children and families. We've managed to get a commitment from the secondary care services within health, which is the physical health services, and from the mental health services, that they will be part of it. And we've already got people like the safeguarding team working from there, the health visitors, the Flying Start team using it as a base. So that's the beginning of what we hope will be a new integrated model for children working from Caldicot. And if that works, we want to roll that model out across Monmouthshire, because we are aware that in some parts of Monmouthshire the services are quite dispersed, particularly in Monmouth. There's lots of services that work in completely different buildings and historically have not worked together. So we know that there's work to do around that. We're also working through a children's strategic partnership which has been set up for Monmouthshire to use that as our means of working across agencies to drive this agenda forward. It's a fairly new setup. It's come from what was the old Children and Young People's Partnership, which the concept of that moved on when PSBs were established. But we've re-established it as a children's strategic partnership. And I think we've had, is it 3 meetings, Charlotte, so far? And there's lots of items on that agenda as well, which are all about the agencies actually working much more collaboratively. So what we hope is that by reporting to the programme board that sits underneath the PSB, that body will actually be the action for this priority and the ACES priority going forwards. We have to make sure that we coordinate with the work that's going on on a regional level. There is a regional children's partnership as well, which is between health and social care across the whole of Gwent. As Charlotte said, Monmouthshire's response to things needs to be different to that of the other local authority areas because we are in a different place. We do have some slightly different nuances in the way we provide services. And Julie Boothroyd and team work to make sure that actually translates into our priorities for the Children and Young People Strategic Partnership. So there's an awful lot happening. I think, just to finish, I would say that I did learn from the engagement event with the children and young people last week as well, that we really need to be listening to what they're telling us their triggers are, what it is that they're not happy about in the way that their services are provided and what their concerns are. There's some, and Sharon was there, you'll agree with me, I'm sure there were some very interesting things that they raised as their major concerns that were affecting their emotional well-being, worrying about their futures. Climate change was a big thing. These won't be any surprise to you, I'm sure, but they were things that we need to be thinking about in the strategic partnership and the programme board and PSB that factor into our plans around meeting children's emotional needs as well. So it's a very, very broad agenda. Okay, thank you.
No, don't be sorry at all. Thank you very much for that comprehensive report. Any questions on what you've heard? Councillor Trehan.
The community psychologist, is just one community psychologist for the whole of Monmouthshire, is there?
Sorry, can you do it for your mic?
Sorry, there is one new post funded for Monmouthshire through the Transformation Fund. We actually do already have a community psychology presence which has been outposted from mental health services, working actually within the, certainly in the centre at Chepstow and Caldicot, and I believe also the same applies in the north of Monmouthshire. So there is already a clinical practitioner psychologist for children with mental health problems out in the field as well.
My second question, the illustration of the iceberg, to try and intervene before it gets too far up, does that require different training to the top level specialists to intervene?
I think it's a two-way thing. It partly requires those highly trained specialists to come down to see children more locally and to provide training and support to the teams that are actually working below the surface. It also requires us, as Charlotte mentioned with some of the initiatives that are happening, to provide training and support outside that specialist service for people on the ground who are working with children and families to improve their expertise.
Councillor Oden.
Thank you, Chair. Well, brilliant presentation, very interesting, fascinating. In fact, thank you very much. Appreciate that. In the presentation, you mentioned silos. I have quite a lot of experience with silos in companies in the past. So may I ask, how are you breaking down the silos? Are there parts of the system that don't work together well at present? And how can this be improved, what do you think? Thank you.
I think both Charlotte and I would probably have something to say on that. I think it would be fair to say that from the health board's perspective, the relationship between different teams traditionally has been quite siloed, even within mental health services. This work is bringing together much more closely, and thanks to Luke Jones being involved. He was previously the manager of the primary care mental health services, which is the services that operate in GP surgeries and out in the community for people with lower level mental health needs. That includes, I think it's 12 is the cut-off, but it includes young people, not so much children, but young people. And that was operating quite separately to the specialist child and adolescent mental health service. His involvement in this pilot project has meant that that barrier is actually now not there, and those services are working very closely together. We're also hoping through the Caldecott pilot to physically bring people together so that we can reduce some of those boundaries, because there are some rules around the way some teams work, particularly things like the Flying Start team are only allowed to intervene officially from a Welsh Government perspective with children in certain categories of family. And that means that there are handoffs between health visitors and Flying Start. And by bringing them together to work in shared environments, it actually reduces a lot of the it's not that the teams are difficult with each other, it's just that the way their rules work means that they're working in different systems. So a lot of effort is being put into trying to address that. And I do believe that Welsh Government are recognising that themselves now and starting to think about whether they can break that barrier down, because they see that it's not working. So Charlotte will give you more insight into how in Monmouthshire we're doing that as well.
I think the early help panel has been critical in that, because it brings people together and they're sat around the same table, and I think it helps people understand what the different different roles people occupy. So one of the things that can create that silo is people just misunderstanding what the role of a social worker is and what the limits of their responsibilities are. So we do quite a lot of work, I think, in terms of trying to bring people together, improve lines of communication, and just be a bit compassionate towards other agencies, because recognising that sometimes we can sound irritable when we're just busy. And email can be a very poor form of communication sometimes. So sometimes it's just about encouraging a bit of compassionate practice, and sometimes it's about bringing people together and ensuring people understand what people's roles are. In terms of the Flying Start and Families First divide, flexible funding will help with that. So we have had different funding streams, different funding pots for the Acorn Centre, which is funded through Families First and Flying Start, and yet they are delivering some of the same services. And what they've been very good at, and again this is driven by an imperative, because Monmouthshire is very small, is they have been delivering for a number of years actually a very integrated model. So whilst Bron is right, there are some issues around handoffs. We do much less of that in Monmouthshire. We're much better at delivering less of a postcode lottery and a much more integrated model in Monmouthshire. So we're quite good at making a virtue of necessity sometimes.
Of course.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the responses. It's clear to me that you're going in the right direction with the breakdown of silos. In my own company in the past, we integrated different departments with single issues to try and get solutions, and it sounds as though the early start is achieving something along those lines. My second issue was with Early Health Panel, you have a reduction in resource as a result of the way it's operating, which is very good. Do you have a central register of people's issues? And linked into that question, is it, if you do, is it Gwent-wide? And what happens for people that are cross-border? Do you have issues with people in Herefordshire and Gloucestershire at all? Or really, that sort of idea? Thank you.
We maintain a database of all the referrals, so because that's important because it gives us intelligence about what the themes are and what the pressures are. And any referral you have to have because it's voluntary. It's pre-statutory threshold. Any referral has to have parental consent to share that information across the panel. So that enables us to work more intelligently with the data as well as meet families' needs better. So yes, we do keep a central database of all the referrals that come in. So we do know what the themes are and we know where those referrals are routed to, and we can track them when referrals come back. And I think historically we've been a bit negative about people coming back. And actually, if you found somebody useful, why would you not go back to them? So I think we need to be a bit more intelligent sometimes about how we see re-referral and recognise that if people are coming back for a different reason, actually that's a good thing and not a bad thing. In terms of how we deal with referrals that come in for out of area, in terms of Gwent, that would be because there are now early help panels, they call them space wellbeing panels in other areas of Gwent, and they're now being started in all of the other 4 authorities across Gwent. They all have space wellbeing coordinators. Our space wellbeing coordinator, or our early help panel coordinator, will refer that to the opposite number in another authority. In terms of across the border in England, it's a bit more difficult because the systems are so different. But that would be a matter of contacting their duty service and seeing what, so signposting back to their home authority. So we work on the geographical location of the family rather than, school, for example.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Devi, would you like to have any questions, or are you okay?
I'm okay, thanks.
No problem. Thank you, Councillor. I have a few. When I saw the iceberg, all I thought was the Titanic. Sorry, that's a bit of a pessimistic stance. Are you confident of this being not too unwieldy? Because I saw that graph, all the squiggle lines and all these different teams, all these different teams, all these different initiatives, the silo working, as Councillor Roden mentioned, is what I would say to that. And I just want to get a sense, my first question is get a sense of your perspective on this.
I think everybody would say that the system was broken. Whoever you spoke to a year ago would have said that the service that was offered to children and young people who presented with a mental health difficulty that was not at the very severest level would not get the service that they needed at the time that they needed it, and there was regularly crisis with a child or family. If you talk to the GPs, I work very closely with the GPs, that's my sort of full-time job, and they would say that the service was awful. The advent of the early help panel in particular has made a massive difference to the needs of children who need early level of support, but not necessarily are yet at the threshold of needing a formal mental health service provided to them. The GPs now say they do know what to do if they have a problem. Families are able to refer in themselves, as are teachers and all other professionals. So something happens within probably 2 weeks for a family, compared with what used to be a wait of sometimes, I believe it was about 18 months before they would be seen by the official mental health services. So things have improved a lot. That's not to say that we're there yet. It's still developmental. As Charlotte's mentioned, things are changing all the time. The pathways are getting a lot less confused than they were, I would say that. So if you looked at that pile of knitting, it would now be more like the wiring inside a wire. So there'd be lots of lines going up, but it wouldn't be all intertwined as much as it is now. It's always the case, though, that if we had more resources, we could do an awful lot more than we're doing. And I think staff within the system, again, Charlotte will know this better than me, but staff within the system are working under a lot of pressure to make it work. So it's not perfect. But I think it does feel as though the way we're going is the right way to go, because it provides that intervention much earlier.
Thank you. That goes to my second question about money. So the Transformation Fund, 3 years, did you say?
I believe it's until May 2020, is that right?
So less than I thought.
It's less time on it left now. The Welsh Government allocated this money specifically on a short-term basis to pump prime transformational change. The Integrated Care Fund funding that we've had over the previous, 5 or 6 years probably now, has been absorbed into core budgets over time, and it has actually resulted in some significant service change happening. This time, my take on it is that the Welsh Government want to really see the evidence that the change that they have been promised in services is delivering. We've been given no guarantee that the funding will continue after the end of this initial period. And the onus is on the organisations, the regional partnership, to prove through the evidence that's gathered from the schemes that are running, to prove that this is the right thing to do. So if the funding isn't forthcoming, I think we all believe that we're doing the right thing, and we have to find the money from within internal budgets to do it if there's no other option. But that is quite a scary prospect, because we are talking about many thousands of pounds for this scheme alone. So we're at the moment not in a position of clarity, I think it would be fair to say.
Yeah, that goes on to my point, what happens when the money runs out. And also, it builds into my other point, which is, what are our KPIs? What by benchmark of the Welsh Government judging success? What is success? What does success look like? What is it? Is it success for us the same as what Welsh Government are looking for? I mean, it doesn't seem very clear to me. There's maybe it is clear, but I'm not clear of, are we both agreed on what success is?
That's a tough question to answer. The transformation bids had to be specifically targeted against the Welsh Government's priorities within the Wellbeing of Future Generations plan. There is a specific transformation bid which relates to the CAMS service transformation, which has been one of Welsh Government's big bugbears over the last 10 years as well, because there's been a huge concern about the amount of funding that Welsh Government have put into CAMS. It is a clear priority for them, being lent on very, very heavily by the Younger People's Commissioner, to improve these services. And all I can say is that Gwent is the only area that's come up with a transformation model around this particular service, and they are looking to us to demonstrate that it can work. So we are doing everything we can to make it work. and it is underpinned. We can actually, you can welcome to look at the original bid that was put in through the regional partnership for this particular scheme, and it is clearly marked what it's intended to achieve within that bid. And it's a challenge, but I believe that right across Gwent, services are working very hard to make it work because everybody thinks it is the right thing to do. But we don't have any guarantees, unfortunately, about the funding.
Another point I'd like to make is that the way the bid was developed was to look at what Gwent was doing well. So Watch, Wait and Wonder, which is an infant mental health project, is a Monmouthshire project. We have been doing that through Families First for 5-6 years. So that's embedded. So they looked at that. It's got a robust evidence base now. Family Intervention Team, which is a Caerphilly project, has got a really sound evidence base in Caerphilly. That's coming our way, not immediately, but we will get that probably in about 12 months. So what they've started with was, what are we doing already well across Gwent that we can build on? So the transformation bid is really scaffolding existing good practice. So some of the things, even if we lost the money tomorrow or in 6 months' time, some of the really good stuff that is happening will continue to happen because we were doing it anyway, and the transformation bid is simply aligned with that good practice. And I think that's really helpful, both in terms of making the case for sustainability and in terms of not losing the value of it if it were to go.
I'm still concerned about capacity and resources, and I'm still not clear. I'm still not clear that our success relates to what Welsh Government sees as success. So I'm not reassured on that, if I'm completely honest. It was just on, I'm glad we moved on to evidence-based. So Monmouthshire's plan, and its wellbeing plan, was based on a survey data, I'm sure Richard would correct me, I think it was 0.1% of Monmouthshire's population. Yeah, 0.1%, I think. If I'm being generous, 0.2% of the people engaged, of the total population. By which, can you give me a better, maybe more optimistic that we've got it absolutely spot on what people need and require? Because such a sample size is not big enough, in my opinion, to really develop a properly targeted resource strategy. And I know you talked about the Children's Forum, and the mind that instantly pops into my head about children's forums or any kind of forum is that you're already dealing with people who are engaged. And when you knock on doors, it's clear that the people we need are the people who are not engaged. In fact, it's even worse than that. They don't even trust the system. They don't want to engage with the system. So we're getting evidence-based from people who are engaged, happy to talk about us, feel confident in expressing their views. And we're not speaking to the people who don't feel confident, don't trust the system. And I'm just going to give me any sense of reassurance that we are speaking to those people as well.
I would entirely agree with you. I think there is one of the risks of youth forums is that you're very often working with almost professionalised young people, and I think we need to be. I think there's a number of things. I think we need to be generally more creative about how we engage with different groups of the population and not just with one group of the population. I think, and what I would say to that is we have a Young Carers Forum, which is made up of actual young carers. We have our BASE project, which is our psychology service for looked after children. They are in the process of developing a forum to improve their service and to get that feedback from some of our very vulnerable children and young people. We have a Care Leavers Forum. And I think one of the things that we need not to lose sight of is the intelligence we can get from people who use our services. So using information that we get from complaints, using information that we get from referral data, what are people asking for, using the distance travel tool, using the feedback that we ask from families who have engaged with our service. What worked for you? What would you do differently? One of the things I would say in terms of how we develop need is a lot of the services aren't based on what a group of people have told us they need. They are based on what that individual family are asking for in that particular. So the Building Strong Families is a strength-based intervention that's entirely bespoke. The model of intervention is as per Welsh Government guidelines, but the actual interventions themselves, they're not delivering a set programme, they're delivering bespoke programmes of support for individual families. And the feedback that they get, I think, is fabulous. I can send you some of that if you would be.
Please do. I'm sure if other committee members.
It's very for me as a service developer. It was very heartening to receive some of the differences that that they are making to families.
Just to add to that, one of the things that the community psychologist that we referred to earlier is intending to do is to actually have focus groups of children and young people in the schools. There was a young man who was at the forum who was very much speaking on behalf of what he called the disaffected kids. And it's quite clear from what he was saying that within the school, those children and young people don't really have a voice. So she picked that up, and she actually did say that she would be going and talking to those groups of children and young people very specifically to find out what their issues were and to make sure that fed into the work that would inform what the community strategy should be for Monmouthshire.
And Richard first, do you want to, because Sharon.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention as well, as part of the Youth Forum, it was the first one that we've done. It was facilitated by Engage to Change, which I take your point absolutely, is those young people who are actively involved in this. The idea of this forum was around how do we expand that to those young people who are not part of Engage to Change and not part of school councils. So it was our first kind of attempt at this and our blueprint for moving forward now. But we did use technology as well. So we did open it up to Mentimeter, which meant that children and young people anonymously could feed in questions, and we had a whole screen full of questions that were coming in on the day that they were filtering some of those comments and things that young people wanted to raise, because we live linked to the schools and made it available throughout the day in the secondary schools for them to be able to feed in. And as part of this as well, we did task Engage to Change with engaging with young people who were sitting in our in Hannah Jones' team, in the 16 plus team, so young people who are potentially NEET or at risk of becoming NEET, and then also some of our housing young people, so young people who've been with Solace and our different housing support providers who've suffered homelessness and maybe are a little bit more disengaged in terms of having their voice heard. So it is early days, but I just wanted to reassure you that we are looking at those harder to reach young people, but using the mechanisms of our currently engaged young people to help us do that in a way that young people want us to do it.
Thank you, that is reassuring. Richard, and I'll bring Councillor Rod.
Just really come back to the point around the wellbeing assessment and just so we get a bit of context in terms of the purpose of that assessment. That was looking across social, economic, environmental, cultural wellbeing. It looked at, obviously, communities' views are very important, and there's around over 1,400 views gathered. But also as part of that was looking at the data, statistics, research, evidence and policy that was out there, alongside that community engagement that was undertaken. And obviously that provided an evidence base then for the PSB to go away and work up what it thought it were, what its objectives were, and also the steps it was looking to take to deliver those. Part of that methodology the PSB adopted was then to look at engaging in experts in areas of those particular areas of steps it's focused on, to explore those in more detail through the sort of double diamond approach that was described in the original wellbeing plan. And I think you've seen examples there of the specific engagement work that's been undertaken on those specific issues to develop our understanding further, taking forward those specific interventions we've talked about today.
Thank you, Richard. Councillor Rodden.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, may I say that your description of the evidence base from those engaged, almost professionalised young people is going to really help me in answer to a question I've got somewhere else. In terms of the data, do you try to speak with people that are regularly truanting and trying to understand a little bit about them, or is it possibly that they're not the kind of people that would require this kind of assessment and assistance? Thanks.
I think, and I guess it also speaks a little bit to the point you were making about all of these services. There are different services that are engaging different groups of children and young people. I know that the pupil referral service is also works with groups of young people, including seeking their feedback. And one of the things that they've been working with their young people is something as simple as the name. Young people coming out of the pupil referral service want to be able to put that they attended a school on their CVs. They don't like putting I was at a PRU, pupil referral unit, when they're applying for jobs. So the PRS, it came to management, I sit on the PRS management committee, and they've come up with, and I can't remember the name, it means new leaf in Welsh. So if anybody knows their Welsh better than I do, I can't remember. I can't remember what, but it's what they really want to be able to do is to call it school, to call it a school, and to be able to put school on there. Yeah. And so we took a view on the management committee that although Eston have to, legislatively, we have to call it a unit, it has to be a PRU. According to legislation, we will allow the pupil referral service itself to refer to itself as a school, because that's what works for the children and young people who engage with that. So, and my other point, which, I was Hannah Jones, who leads on work with young people who are at risk of becoming not engaged in employment, education and training. I hate the expression NEET. That group of children and young people, a lot of the work that needs to be done with those on getting their experiences are so individual that sometimes we treat groups of young people as if an individual young people can speak for all of them, and their views can be represented as a cohort. And sometimes a lot of the work, they need to be individually feel they are being listened to. And I think Hannah's work does that very, very well. There's all kinds of things that we could do better, and that I think we are doing better. We are learning how to do things better. But I also think sometimes the youth forums and those kinds of groups can tick all the boxes, but do that badly. And I think there's an awful lot of work that is ongoing, but it's much harder to capture, that genuinely does do that work really, really well. It's how we aggregate that up. So we are getting that. I think there is work to be doing. And I'm leading a piece of work on developing a participation strategy that is looking at that thing. I just haven't got around to finishing it yet. But I am on the case.
I believe you are. And do you want to come back, or?
No, thank you, Chair.
I have another question. Sorry, I'm like this. Charlotte, your section, I was, to be honest, the most uplifting intervention I've heard in council for years, about your work, about your enthusiasm, about the impact you're starting to have. And I was so pleased to hear a council officer talk about Monmouthshire poverty. It seems to be particularly worse because of the gap of inequality. This is my little personal bugbear of mine. You mentioned in that, you talked about research. Now, I don't know if you were talking about local research or were you talking about national research, but you said there was research underpinning that thinking. Could you enlighten me where that is and where I could read it?
I will do some digging for you. It was a piece of work that Dr. Rhiannon Cobner did. So it does exist. It is out there. I will find it. Local.
Oh, great. Yes.
I will find it and get it to you.
Would you guys want the copy of that? I think all members would like a copy of that. That would be very, very useful. Thank you. Any other questions, queries? Great. Thank you very much for your time and for the presentation. And please circulate the presentation to us, because I found it hard to read personally from a distance.
I do apologise because I was skipping through.
No, it's fine. No, it's fine. Sorry. Councillor Dovey.
Just one question. Chair, can I go now, please?
Okay.
You should have waited for 5 minutes.
You can leave at any time. This is not a prison.
Are you sure? Are you sure? I've got to go. The battery's gone flat. Mine as well.
So the boss to the right of me tells me, I have to, well, and I sort of agree with this, are we reassured by their evidence? Is the committee reassured by what we have just heard?
Yes.
That was a reluctant yes.
I was more concerned of the community psychologist being on their own and a support mechanism for her, because it's a big county, there's a lot of work, but apparently there's others out there as well, which is good. So overall, it seems promising.
I would say that the data they presented was positive. I'm worried about ongoing funding, because I think that they're doing something that's really worthwhile. So the funding issue is my major concern. I was going to ask about further resources coming in from Nyren and Bevan as part of this, because they tend to have more money than the county councils. But I didn't push that. But, funding only. Thanks.
I had the same question, but I didn't ask it. Maybe we should have. Now I feel guilty. Because I think that's true, and I think one of the questions maybe we need to push further later on the line is, to what extent are Nyren and Bevan going to put their money where their mouth is? Is it the wrong way around? Oh yeah. I was previously known as blank, which is preferable. But maybe it's a point we need to push in future meetings, just in the general piece. Where's the money? Who's it going to come from? And if we find out it works, and I think my personal concern is, it's not clear what Welsh Government want and what they define as success and what we define as success. And so we might think something's going great, including the Health Board, and then Welsh Government might say, no, it's not. And I just think there's a bit of a disconnect there, personally. And I totally agree with your other 2 points. Community psychologist, just one, that's a tough job. Yeah, that's a tough job. Thank you very much. I think that was quite an uplifting and engaging report. Let's move on then. Richard?
Thank you, Chair. So the report before you today is the first annual report of the Public Service Board, reporting on the progress made since the publication of the Monmouthshire Wellbeing Plan in May 2018. The report provides an overview of the progress made to deliver the objectives the Public Service Board set and the steps set out within it. You'll hopefully recognise a lot of the activity covered within the plan, as it's been part of the scrutiny work programme throughout the year, particularly in the last few months. I don't propose to go through the report in great detail. Hopefully it's self-explanatory, but it does set out and cover in total the context of developing the objectives and steps on which I referred to earlier, and the further detail that is contained in the full Wellbeing Plan Annex, which was published on the website back in May 2018. It sets out how the 5 ways of working of the Future Generations Act have continued to be applied in the Public Service Board's work on the Wellbeing Plan. It sets out the progress against those prioritised steps in the Wellbeing Plan, particularly focusing on the 6 prioritised steps, which have all been part of your agendas in the recent months, and one of those, obviously, you've scrutinised in detail today as well, which is the final one of the 6 to come before you. It sets out your role of scrutiny and what you've done as part of your work plan to scrutinise the work of the Public Service Board. It sets out the progress made by the Public Service Board on areas where it set out needs to work better together, and some examples of work that have gone on in those areas. And it also covers progress on regional working and projects that have been undertaken in association with other public service boards utilising Welsh Government funding in particular. So that's broadly what it covers. The report has already been published on the website, as it's a statutory requirement to publish the report 14 months after the Wellbeing Plan was produced, which was 4th of July. So the report is on the website. This is your opportunity today to ask any questions you may have of it. I say hopefully a lot of it will be familiar with you, and I think you've seen from the scrutiny today and the scrutiny you've done the last few months, you've got a lot more detail from those step leads who've come before you and explained how they're developing the step, the actions they've taken, proposed future actions as well. If there is any points of technical detail for those, Sharon and I will try and help. We can't replicate, for example, the expertise you've seen this afternoon from other colleagues, so if we need to, we may need to get back to you with some responses.
Thank you, Richard. Councillors, any questions on the annual report? Councillor Rodden.
Thank you, Chair. I've been looking at table on page 22, which is the table that links the various aspects that we're looking at, such as ACEs, obesity, well-being in schools, mental health, etc. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the adverse childhood events in the ACEs section, isn't obesity something that could be regarded as an adverse event? Because I think it does have a major impact on children. Thank you.
I feel like a fraud now. I think Charlotte probably would have answered this far better than me. I think in terms of the research that's come out from public health around the trauma-informed practice and what they recognise as being adverse childhood experiences, there could be potentially links in terms of whether a child is exposed to things such as bullying or harassment, that kind of behaviour around a child's weight and ability to participate in the way that they perhaps would like to if they are significantly obese or overweight. But in terms of the evidence base, it's focusing very much on those factors that cause trauma from when a child is first born through its years of development and how that impacts on the body's ability to heal and to repair itself, and that flight or fight response that is always going on in a child who's exposed to really traumatic experiences in the home environment. So potentially links in terms of how a child does develop and grow. But in terms of the research around adverse childhood experiences, they're quite specific around the trauma within the household. So
it's the definition of ACEs that I was uncertain of, and that makes sense. Thank you very much.
No other questions? I have a few. So, first one is question page 29. It's just a question of, there's like an average life satisfaction score, happiness score, anxiety score, which are also self-explanatory. Average worthwhile score, is life worthwhile? I mean, that's not very clear what that means, so I'm just looking for a bit of clarity on that.
That's taken from the ONS's Measuring National Wellbeing Programme. So that's questions they've asked to better understand individuals' wellbeing. I haven't got the specific definition in front of me for that, but we can get it to you because it's part of their methodology.
Yes, could you? Because worthwhile doesn't really tell me anything personally. Second question, and it's another bugbear of mine, and I've asked it, is on the wellbeing objectives, all 7 of them, how are we weighting them in terms of priority when it comes to big controversial decisions? So, example, the M4 Relief Road, but there's many others. Is it satisfaction? Is it by simple majority, 4/3? Or is it one particularly gains out of it and the other 7 suffer? Who makes that call? My understanding from the Future Generations Commissioner is that they're all equally weighted, which means to me that nothing will ever be done. So I'm just wondering, have we got any further clarity on that? Do we give any more explanation to that? Are we getting any guidance on that?
So for the question, it's how we weight the 7 national wellbeing goals set from the FG Act when making our decisions. So in terms of how we formulated, and the PSB has formulated its wellbeing plan, it's taken consideration of the wellbeing assessment evidence that's come out and used that then to formulate its objectives and then set its prioritised steps. In doing that, it's looked at how those steps and objectives taken, how do they contribute to the 7 goals? So it gives consideration to these objectives we're looking to, these steps, sorry, I get the terminology right, for clarity, the steps we're looking to take, how do they link to these wellbeing goals set by the Welsh Government and gives consideration to those. So in terms of this plan, that's how they've been applied, is saying, does the action we're taking in Monmouthshire for this objective apply to one of those goals? And that indication on those tables for each of the 4 objectives shows you how that goal, that objective in Monmouthshire links to the goal under the Future Generations Act. So there's no greater weighting given to any one of those over and above anything else. It's just saying how do these, which we think are important issues in Monmouthshire, how do they contribute to the Future Generation Act goals?
So we don't measure the negative effect of a particular goal. So if we say we had an objective, we'll focus on a solution, and it was brilliant for 6 of them, fantastic, but it was really terrible on one of them, say globally responsible Wales. I'm just making this up now. We wouldn't recognise that. We just wouldn't acknowledge it in our little solution table. We'll just say that it's good for 6.
Sorry. I know I've been part of workshops recently with my counterparts across Wales, and at those workshops for PSB coordinators, it's a network meeting. And we have conversations around this with the Future Generations Commissioner's Office and Welsh Government officers as well. And I don't believe, I could be wrong, but I don't believe there is any kind of clear definition. But what the Future Generations Commissioner is very much looking for is for all PSBs to consider all 7 of the goals when you're looking at those areas. And as you say, quite rightly, Chair, that if there is one that potentially doesn't present itself to be hitting that many of the goals or is very weak in comparison to others, it can be seen as maybe potentially as not a priority at that time, but your justification for why that is also has to be there. So it's not a case of just saying, well, it didn't hit that goal. We have to be able to justify why it doesn't hit that goal and why we need to potentially look at other steps prior to some of the steps in the sequencing of how we take the work forward. So really the challenge is that it might not hit all 7 of the goals, it might only hit 1 or 2 goals, but we have to be able to demonstrate our evidence of why that is and how we've come to that conclusion.
Still sounds very ad hoc to me. I've pressed the Future Generation Commissioner on this as well. She didn't give me an answer. Number 4, and I've asked this before, and I still haven't had a great answer on this, a more equal Wales. What does equal mean? Income, wealth, just acceptance in the community? What does equal mean? Also, how on earth would we measure that?
Just looking at each other. So I'm just looking for the definitions. Each of those 7 goals has a definition alongside it that sets out what is meant by each of them and how then, when we are given our consideration in terms of what we're doing as a PSB to deliver against those, how we take account of those issues and definition. I haven't got it in front of me, but Sharon has.
It says opportunity.
Sorry, the definition around more equal Wales, this is the definition from the guidance. A society that enables people to fulfil their potential no matter what their background or circumstances, and this is including their socio-economic background and circumstances.
So it's equality of opportunity, not equality.
Yes, I believe that's what the guidance is telling us.
Okay, so how do we measure that?
I think it's a very good question. I think part of the presentation that we've just heard is, and as Charlotte rightly said, and the evidence that we now know and we've gathered around, as we were saying, the affluence divide within the county and how much more stark it is for people who are potentially living in poverty compared to affluent families. So I think for us to measure that, it's going to be around what our intervention looks like in terms of what we're working with those families to do or to help or to improve, and how that then can link back to the actual performance management framework, which we will be developing in line, well, we are currently developing in line with the wellbeing plan at the moment. So I can't give you a definitive answer at this time, Councillor, but it is certainly something that I think over the time that we've been researching some of these steps and working with the experts to understand the challenges, it's very much about what is the challenge, what are we trying to change, and how can we measure that will be the question for us, rather than doing a particular activity because we know we can measure it. And it's more about understanding how we can measure some of this stuff that we would like to try and do at the moment.
Councillor Roden, of course.
Thank you. A very interesting part of the conversation, this. If you're suggesting that areas where you have relatively high level of inequality creates issues, what that means is to reverse that, you have to try and have similar levels of equality in the area to avoid it, which then goes against the structure of housing being, mixed types of housing and things. It to some extent, because then you'd have less relative poverty measurement, I think. It's just sort of a logical thing, really. I'm not suggesting for a minute that's what we do, but interesting thought.
I love logic. That's why I asked those questions.
I would only, from that perspective, say, yes, it is a challenge. I don't think anything that we're working through at the moment has been something that we're familiar with. It's certainly not an area that I think our counterparts and other public services that we're working with at the moment have had to think about things in this way. So I would definitely say the Act is working in terms of challenging what we need to do as public bodies around some of these difficulties and some of these complex issues. They're not going to be simple solutions at all. But I would also say that part of this is around also people's well-being, and what well-being means to an individual is going to vary greatly. So some individuals might see their well-being as potentially having the same standard of living as other people. For other people, it could just be as simple as ensuring that their children are happy, healthy and housed. So, but how we measure that is going to be difficult, I would say.
Councillor Trahan.
Thank you. So, understanding that equality is opportunity, giving everybody the same opportunities to achieve a higher level, it's down to personal aspiration, isn't it? And how can you encourage two different people to aspire to the same thing if they're not interested in? So how can you create equality if people's aspirations are different?
No, absolutely take that point, Councillor. Sorry, as well. I think for this as well, what is attached to the Act is the ways of working that we have to also take into consideration now. So I believe, around the integration, collaboration and prevention agenda, and it's also about, this is a bottom-up piece of legislation, so what we need to be good at and getting better at doing is listening to the people in the community and listening to what really matters to them. And it's about how can we now as public bodies, and part of that is some of the presentation you've heard earlier as well around mental health, how do we position ourselves so we're working with and alongside rather than doing to communities. So I think in terms of how you manage people's perception and desires and aspiration is going to be very crucial to how we listen to what people are telling us and we hear what they're telling us and how we can potentially help them meet whatever their goal is. That is quite aspirational because we can't be everything to everybody. But this is about ensuring that we're taking our communities on this journey with us and we're working with them to hear them and understand what really does matter to them.
Yes, because haven't heard that, then the equality bit is many segments. So you're not catering just for one ideological equality, you're catering for several. And the scope in that and the work involved in that, I'm interested to know where the Welsh Government stand on this equality bit, knowing that different aspirations for different people is a major factor in this. I can't, because up until now, it didn't occur to me, you see, but it's all very well saying equality and everything, but everybody's different. So everybody's got their own, sorry.
Yeah, I've had this problem with this for years, hence I keep asking the question. It just seems very loose, I think, and even though and all our definitions of what equality actually is quite varied, and it just feels like it's a nice thing to put in, but then anything we judge any objective on could be different forms of equality. Does that make any sense? And I'm just like, if we're measuring people's happiness, are we trying to equal the level playing field for everyone to be happy? But then everyone is happy in different ways and in different situations. And some people are made happy by money, and some people are made not, you know, they don't mind money. I mean, that's my point, I suppose. Sorry, I'm being a bit more of an academic about this. And I just don't feel like we get the clarity from that, which is actually a problem when we come to implementation. And so that's why I asked that question, not just to be a pain. Last question, I promise. On the hard data, the national indicators, and I'm going to be fair to the Council and to Monmouthshire and to all our partners, many of these will be beyond our control, like way beyond our control. Pollution in the air, for example, you know, there could be a factory in Bristol, for example. Material deprivation, you know, that is linked to national governments in many ways. They'll be doing things that we can't and cannot control. So those national indicators, how useful are they to us? And why I ask that question is, so from my personal concern, material deprivation in Monmouthshire has gone up. And it might have gone up, but we might be doing great things here, which has stopped it from going up higher than it would have if we hadn't been doing something. But I don't get that from this data. Or it might have been better if we had been doing certain things. You know, it could work either way. But I don't get that from this data. It's just telling me it's gone up. I'm just wondering how useful that is to us as councillors to know we are having a positive effect or we're having a negative effect. Are we having an effect?
Chair. I think the national indicators is one source of evidence for us. And I think looking the way the national indicators have been used so far by the PSB is A, to consider them as part of their wellbeing assessment, and B, obviously in this plan there's been identified that some of those indicators are particularly relevant to some of the areas of activity we're taking as a public service board, and also then to look at where they are there, is there any Monmouthshire level data to give us a bit part of that picture in terms of what those issues show. You're right to recognise that they're not necessarily measuring the performance of one individual body or one individual PSB, and there's numbers of factors that influence them. I think in terms of understanding your point about what our impact is or what the PSB's impact is on some of those steps, it's for us, as part of what Sharon's alluded to, through our performance and programme management arrangements, to look at what our interventions are, establishing what success looks like on those interventions, and evaluating through a range of methods. You know, some of these areas are particularly complex, some of the challenges we haven't necessarily grappled with before, so the ways and means in which we measure ourselves may not be a hard KPI, it may be a piece of research, it could be some milestones in the short term with some longer term measures of success over time. So I think in terms of how the PSB uses national indicators, one helpful source of evidence, but very much alongside our own evidence and our own arrangements we'll put in place, look specific to Monmouthshire in terms of the activities we will take forward to understand our impact on those issues we're identifying. And part of that is understanding what our impact is and what the impact is from a range of other factors that may impact upon that area. As a PSB, obviously collectively, there's more partners around the table, so there's more partners to have a collective impact. But even so, then there's still other factors that would be outside of those public services around the tables control as well. So just trying to understand those across the 4 objectives and across each step that's in the objectives, which hopefully some of that programme performance management arrangements will help us understand in more detail alongside the national indicators.
Okay, great. Thank you. Material deprivation and poverty. I think the definitions are particularly important here in trying to understand what's going on. Like if it's relevant, improvement at the top, however you measure it, means that there's an increase of relative poverty or material deprivation overall. Isn't that the case? So I don't understand the exact definitions, but it would be beneficial to actually see the definitions to understand more about what's really happening. That would be very interesting from my perspective. Thank you.
Could we facilitate that?
For which area in particular? Is there a particular indicator, or is that just overall looking at material deprivation and poverty? Is there a particular reference in the plan you're referring to? Just to clarify. So
no, I was looking at in general.
Just in general. I just want to make sure and not.
Councillor Petruni was bringing up a point about material deprivation, and I thought, well, that's really interesting. How do you actually measure it? And what's actually happening on the ground? You know, if you could look at the individual statistic almost to find out and see what really is happening. Okay, thank you.
part of that would be in terms of some of the evidence that was brought forward in the wellbeing assessment. So the evidence base was put before the plan. So we can certainly look back at that. And I think some of it will come in terms of some of the specific interventions now happening as part of that programme and performance management framework we'll put in place as well to help some of that. But I think there's obviously a lot. It's a complex area of research, something that I wouldn't necessarily be fully sighted on being able to give you an articulate answer on. There's certainly something we need to consider, I think is fair to say, going forward and in the work we've already done. Something we'll look at, definitely. I can't give you the...
But it is a really impertinent point the councillor has raised, because definition really matters. It really matters. And I give you an example of child poverty. So child poverty measured by DWP is completely different to the child poverty measured by Loughborough University, which had recent press news coverage, which is different to End Child Poverty Now definition of how you assess a child in poverty. And so, you know, I'm surprised, actually leads me to another question, but I think having definitions is really going to be useful for us to hold, at least to understand where we get that figure from and how it was derived, because then it allows us to critique that definition maybe, or at least have an understanding that there could be a different view or a different perspective on that indicator. So I totally endorse those comments. Sorry, of course.
In terms of that percentage of people living in households of material deprivation, there is a nationally set definition behind that. I think it's hyperlinked, should be hyperlinked to the source from the plan you've got, which will tell you in terms of how that indicator is derived. Appreciating the points raised about there is for different indicators various.
But in that box underneath, could we not just put it?
Yeah, we could, yeah.
Yeah, for each of those indicators.
We're conscious of trying to make it accessible as well. And mention there's a range of audiences who look at this. Some people want the quick snap view, which is why I put the source in there. But something we can consider maybe for the different audiences.
Just a query, and I've queried this before. Why don't we, given what we've just heard about early intervention and about getting there early, why aren't we measuring child poverty?
If I can talk a little bit about this. We have, through one of the partnership groups under the Public Services Board, developed a piece of work as part of the social justice strategy as well, identified across the life course specific actions that contribute towards mitigating or tackling poverty and child poverty in particular. That has been a developing piece of work at the moment, so we've just got our first sort of draft iteration of that, and those actions that have been identified through multi-agency collaboration and working to try to understand the issues in more detail and how some of that potentially can relate to Monmouthshire. Those actions now are in the process of being disseminated to relevant partnerships. So, for example, First 1,000 Days and the evidence that we know contributes towards the mitigation and prevention of child poverty at that early stage of life. Those actions will now go across to our Early Years Development and Childcare Partnership, again, which is multi-agency, to look at how we can develop and take forward what we know is the evidence base, but how that relates to the challenges that we have in Monmouthshire around that issue, and look at how we can develop the actions in relation to taking that forward to try to mitigate some of the child poverty. But it is very early stages at the moment. They have only just completed their first draft of that plan. And as I say, it is going over to what I would consider to be the more experts to have a look at that in a little bit more detail.
Oh yeah, I've read that plan. I've got it here. There's hardly any mention of child poverty, no KPIs on child poverty. And if we're all trying to intervene, you just said we know the evidence base, but I don't know the evidence base. These councillors don't know the evidence base, I presume maybe. And I've read the report, I've read the first iteration, and it's not clear from there how we're really targeting this.
Sorry, Councillor. I think that's where the draft at the moment has kind of established the areas that we believe that we're either delivering currently or we need to be looking at delivering in currently. And I think, again, it goes back to once we understand what that is and what that looks like and what the potential action needs to be, how do we know that we're shifting and measuring that? And the evidence base they've used to develop that plan, I do apologise, that's probably is sitting with the FEDIT partnership and the agencies around the table there who've used that evidence base to inform that action plan going across.
Could you send me the evidence base and any other councillor interested in the evidence?
Yes, absolutely.
Any other questions? No? So it's to accept or is it just to note? It's members are scrutinised. We scrutinise it and we reviewed it. Is everyone comfortable with that?
Yes, Chair, I am.
Yeah, and I think there's a series of action points that we councillors have asked for that officers have said they would send to us. So we move on then. Great, thank you, councillors. To item 8, select terms of reference. Over to Hazel.
Okay, this report has been taken through, firstly, the Democratic Services Committee, and their view was that they were happy with the report and that I should bring it to you. And the next stage would be that it goes to full council. So to just give you a brief outline of the report, it suggests a change to your title of your select committee, and that would be in terms of referencing sort of actual change to your remit. So the proposal is to rename this select committee a public services select committee. So you're dropping the board. The relevance of that is to encompass the scrutiny of wider public services. So instead of just scrutinising this board, it would be to encompass wider service delivery. If I take you through the report, you'll see under the options appraisal the reasons that we're suggesting that. Firstly, option 1 is to continue with the current arrangements, but these were put together several years ago. Simplicity was a bespoke select committee, but I think you've said to us in the past, and we've taken that on board, that some of the work that you were scrutinising seems to be mainly around plans and progress of plans and delivery of actions, and some of these services are not necessarily services that you see and encounter day to day. As officers, we felt that there are some other services that could benefit from scrutiny that are currently not directly scrutinised by the other select committees, and would be appropriate to be scrutinised here and actually are tangential to some of the discussions we've had today and in other meetings. So option 2 is to broaden the remit of this committee. You would still provide accountability for the Public Service Board as you currently do, but you would also have capacity and a desire, as I think you've sort of said in the past, to look outside at more collaborative service delivery. We've sort of brought this to you really to say, you know, if you would like to do this, we could take this forward and make those changes. There wouldn't be direct implications for you other than perhaps an increase in meetings. But I think one of the more positive things that you would gain would be a broader sort of scrutiny role, probably a wider interest in some of the services that could be brought to you. And ultimately, in terms of our scrutiny arrangements, it would provide enhanced accountability for some of the collaborative work that's been undertaken. So happy to take questions, Chair.
Councillor.
Thank you, Hazel. I can see reasons for the move. It does make sense. However, it does depend on the attitudes of the other bodies that we might be scrutinising. And if they are against it, how will we be able to do it? Because it does have resource implications for us, you know, over time, extra meetings, extra staff, extra costs at a time when we're trying to avoid that. Thank you.
Well, deep within the papers, in some of the appendices, I've sort of referenced that you have powers to scrutinise the Public Service Board. You don't have powers to scrutinise other bodies as in a requirement for them to attend scrutiny. But neither do you have that within the other select committees, and it doesn't stop you undertaking that scrutiny there. So if you go back to the Local Government Act 2000, you'll see that there's a line in there that says that you can scrutinise anything that affects Monmouthshire residents. So that does give you a broader remit. We've not had problems in the past in getting external partners to attend scrutiny. We've developed quite strong relationships with the Health Board and Adult Select Committee. They're quite frequent attenders there. So it hasn't posed a problem in the past, but we are working within the legislation which gives us only power to scrutinise formally the Public Service Board and hold them to account through this committee. But we do call in partners to other select committees, and it hasn't been a problem in the past. I think you have to go back to that overall responsibility to scrutinise issues that relate to service provision in Monmouthshire.
And, oh, sorry, I left this on. Second point, if I may. Don't other bodies have their own scrutiny boards, and what are they doing? Thanks.
Actually, they don't. Most don't. The fire service does, but a lot of bodies don't. And in the past, discussions with the health board, they've actually sort of welcomed coming to local government scrutiny to talk about the performance. They've started to produce a sort of quarterly performance report, which they send to all local authorities in Gwent, and they're happy to attend. And they've been to our Adult Select Committee, so they've actually welcomed the enhanced scrutiny. It's, as I say, that's something that we've discussed with Welsh Government in terms of giving us wider scrutiny powers. We don't have powers to formally scrutinise other bodies, but we've got the ability to ask them to attend scrutiny, and we've never, ever been refused. In terms of the resources, you picked up resource issue, it would possibly increase the number of meetings of this select committee. The proposal would be that the 5 scrutiny chairs would take a role of chair, which isn't sort of impinging on the SRA allowance. That was the proposal that we set up with this committee at the time. And usually there would be one of those chairs here today. There isn't today, and Councillor Dimitri Batrouni has decided to chair for us, which is great. But usually we would have one of the select chairs here who would undertake that. Sharon, do you have anything to add in terms of what you feel the extended remit might bring? We've talked about possible scrutiny of VAUDAVs and other areas that don't necessarily fall within our existing scrutiny remit. And I mean, an example today is that you've talked a lot about CAMS and the support that the Health Board is providing there. That actually is something that Children and Young People Select Committee are very interested in. They've got a desire to engage with the Youth Forum and to have some of the discussions that we've had today with the base and family care teams. So, you know, this is tangential, but the reason for the select chairs being on the Public Service Board is the select committee is so that if they want to go back and do a more detailed sort of piece of scrutiny in their committees, they can do so. What we're proposing here is some of the work that doesn't fall within a single select committee's remit could possibly be better placed here.
Yeah, I suppose very, very briefly, I think for when Hazel and I have spoken about this with Matt, there is a few duties and a few responsibilities that have naturally or have, as part of the change in the legislation, been positioned with public service boards. So, for example, the Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Act, and with the governance for that now is squarely with public service boards, although the work of that board has been regionalised. So the duties have been discharged by PSBs to the regional board as a collaborative across the Gwent region. But again, recognising that unless that board is called in or elements of that board are called in through individual scrutiny functions, the collective delivery of that board is unscrutinised in that sense. So and potentially where our efforts around how we're tackling and mitigating domestic abuse in the county, that board is regionally taking forward how we do that and how we approach the new legislation. So in terms of scrutinising that, then I think it's a good example of how we could potentially justify work that would be sitting with the Public Service Board that has been regionalised, but your role actually in how you're ensuring that that board is actually delivering sufficiently for our population in Monmouthshire. So, and there are a number of things that have been regionalised. Potentially, Monmouthshire is one partner across the Gwent region that we potentially could have a role in looking at the detail of that and how that is servicing the needs across Monmouthshire more broadly as part of a Gwent function.
Councillors, are you satisfied with those responses? I personally think it's a great move, and I really look forward to having the Health Board here and scrutinising them. Personally. Yeah. I think you might find an appetite from other councillors coming to scrutinise, for example, the Health Board. So we go straight to the recommendations then, which is 2.1, 2.2 and 2.3. I won't go through them in detail, but it's to change the name and to change the existing terms of reference. Are all councillors happy with that? Yeah. Great.
To be honest, Chair, given that you've just agreed to change the terms of reference and the title of the committee, I think myself and officers need to sit down and work out what would be next sort of appropriate to bring you. Also bearing in mind some of the conclusions that you've drawn today in terms of further information on performance indicators and definitions, we can go away and do that. But I think if you're going to agree to broaden the sort of remit of the committee, it might be really helpful to start with something new and fresh and try and reinvigorate the membership of the committee.
Any comments, councillors?
I'd agree with that. I think that maybe bringing the Health Board in first, whilst it would be beneficial in numbers, it might not be the right one to start with. Perhaps we should bite off something that we can chew at the start without causing too many issues. Thank you.
It is worth noting that the Health Board will be due to return to Adult Select later this year in the autumn. So we'll make sure everybody's aware of that. But perhaps something new and different to bring to this committee will generate more interest.
I think that's a reasonable request. So we'll defer the forward work programme for officers to review, given the changing terms of reference. Do we need to take a vote on that, or is it just accepted? Okay, great. Item 10, to note the date and time of the next meeting, 12th of September at 10 a.m. Has anyone got a problem with that or issue? Obviously, we're off for August. Yippee. Nope, great. It's in the diary. Great. Thank you ever so much. Thank you, officers and councillors, and off to freedom. Meeting closed.